Well, thank you, Shelley, and good evening, everyone. My co-author and I, the great disruptor, thanks you for showing up tonight. As Shelley said, I'm the president of the Environics group of market research, communications consulting companies, the Environics Institute. I want to thank Mayor Nenshi for, in the green room, providing me unsolicited advice on how the market research and polling industry should improve its methodologies. I have no advice about how to be a great mayor. I think you'll figure that out. Anyway, anything I say tonight there will be no margin of error. This is all fact. It's all 100% correct with nothing, no plus or minus 5% tonight. Well, anyway, in midlife, I started to write books. First one was Sex in the Snow. It was not my autobiography. My girlfriends in high school reminded me that I was interesting, but not that interesting, so people keep you in line. I did Fire and Ice, United States, Canada, Myth of Converging Values. I thought I was done with staying alive. I was burying my fellow baby boomers in 2010. When, in 2016, on November the 8th, sitting in front of the TV with a glass of Chardonnay in my hand, I was watching the election results in the United States, as were, I'm sure, many of you. I went to bed actually not knowing what would happen. I got up the next morning and found that the good people of Pennsylvania, my cousins in Michigan, and other distant relatives in Wisconsin had done something no one could conceive that they had done. They had elected Donald Trump as President of the United States. My prop will now go here. Holy cow, I guess, is how I reacted. I knew my fellow Canadians as well would be a little bit upset. Polls in Canada had shown that if we had voted in the American election, our first choice would have been Hillary Clinton. Even Canadian Conservatives would have voted for Hillary. Even Calgarians would have voted for Hillary. Even people who knew Ted Cruz, Calgary's greatest contribution to the American political firmament, who now is ensconced in the Senate and represents the people of Texas. The second choice would not have been Donald Trump on the part of Canadians. It would have been Jill Stein, the Green Party leader. So I had a sense that the Canadians probably, would be kind of wondering, okay, we've seen what's going on in Europe with the rise of xenophobic nationalism in response to all the refugees coming from the Middle East and Africa. Now they see Trump down in the United States. We've got to be next, right? Could it happen here? Well, you do a book, and you can't just tell people about polls and surveys and so on. You've got to put your country in context. So I looked at our country in context. It actually wasn't such a great story. The history of our relations with Aboriginal people is not that great. It didn't start out too badly, but then it went quite badly. The 19th century was quite unfortunate. Residential schools, of course, we're actually just moving now into a period of truth and whatever we can define as reconciliation. That's still to be determined. Well, then we had the Catholics and the Protestants. They didn't get along very well. The Irish came. We really thought everything was over. Civilization would be going down the drain with the Irish, and I think we were partly right. But anyway, then we have to fill up the great expanse of the Canadian West. So Clifford Sifton, a member of the cabinet of Laurier, brought in the Poles and the Ukrainians, and I guess we thought they would be better than the Americans taking over the place, so they did. But they were, of course, further down on the status hierarchy in those days. We treated the Chinese terribly, head taxes. The Japanese were interned in the Second World War, and then Jews leaving Nazi Europe, got in a boat to St. Louis, went to Cuba, turned away, went to the US, turned away, and came to Canada. And our response was, none is too many, not very generous. They went back to Europe, and a good number of them actually died in Nazi camps. Not a great history, but suddenly in the 1950s and 60s, particularly in the early 60s, we changed. And I think part of the change came about because Quebec Quebecers, French Quebecers, who'd always been kind of second-class citizens in this country, were asserting themselves, saying we want to be treated as equals. We want respect in this country. We responded with the Royal Commission on Bilingualism and Biculturalism. Again, those Poles and Ukrainians from the West said, well, not everybody's just a descendant of the French and the English in this country, we're here too. So we invented the concept of multiculturalism. It's a Canadian neologism that now the world understands as a Canadian contribution. We then made it an act, and we put it, we made it kind of official in 1971 and again in 1988. But the more important thing we did in 1967 was to get rid of a racist immigration policy. And we went from a policy that privileged white Europeans to a policy that said people are going to get into this country on merit. So, education, skills we need, and have some rudimentary understanding of English or French. We invited the world to come to Canada. The world came to Canada. That world that came to Canada in the year now, 2016, the latest census, 20%, actually 22% in the latest census, foreign-born, foreign in our country, from 100 different countries. Second generation, that's another 20%. 40% of our country is foreign-born or first generation, second generation. In our cities across the country, the proportions are even higher. I come from Toronto. Toronto's 50% foreign-born. Second generation takes us up to 75%. This is an astounding proportion. Vancouver is similar. What do people do when they come to Canada? Well, you get here, get your kids in public school, you get a job, and what do? You become a citizen. What do citizens do? Citizens vote. 85% of immigrants who come to our country who are eligible are citizens. They vote. What do people who do vote? After a while, they join a political party. What do people do then? They run for nomination. They get elected. 46 members of our current parliament are foreign-born. No other country in the world comes close to that proportion. Where are they in our parliament? They are conservatives. They are liberals. They are New Democrats. They're in our cabinet. The Minister of Immigration comes from Somalia. The Minister of Defense is from South Asia, from India. And now the New Democratic Party have elected a guy with a turban and a kirpan. Should we elect him Prime Minister, we will be able to get rid of the defense budget because he will be able to defend us with his ceremonial dagger, banging down all those missiles coming from North Korea. Thank you.